Hello everyone, welcome to our English session for this morning. Nice to see lots of you joining us already, and I know that there'll be more people joining shortly. But just to get started, today is the last session that we have looking at paper 1, question 2, because we've been doing that this whole week and have looked at it through a variety of texts. So today is the last session on that. It will be an hour long like all of the others, and we'll have 45 minutes for the teaching and 15 minutes at the end for questions. You should know where to send the questions through, but if you don't, you can do that through either the chat or through the Q&A function, and Vicki or myself will be able to pick them up. So if you're new to the English sessions today, then they're all led by our tutor Vicki, who isn't only a tutor but is also a qualified teacher, and has done lots and lots of lessons with my tutor. So she's got lots to say about not only the text specifically, but about the exam paper as well. So I'm going to hand over to Vicki now to lead the session.
Good morning, everybody. Nice to see you all again. What's going on here? Right, okay, so as Frederica said, this is going to be our last session on paper 1, question 2. So I'm going to sort of do a wide variety of sort of summing up things. I'm going to go through a variety of terminology, some of which has been a little hazy, which you guys asked me to go over. As well as some tips, some frequently asked questions that you guys have sort of consistently been asking during the week, just so I can address everything and make sure that we're all on the same page. Just to say that in terms of what the question paper looks like, what you're expected to do, this is very much more AQA based, so we have been AQA based the entire week, but you're able to take away sort of how you can analyse, how you can structure the terminology usage. You've taken that away. This is going to be a bit more specific towards AQA, but there will be bits and pieces which you can also definitely take away. Right, so the first thing somebody asked me to have a look at for today was the different types of clauses. So with this, there's 2 that you need to worry about. Now, I haven't bothered covering this previously this week. It wasn't a mindful, no, I'm not going to look at clauses. It's something which is very useful to know. This is probably something more that you looked at when you were at primary school. This is something which, when you come to your SATs at Key Stage 2, knowing what clauses are and identifying word classes, those sorts of things, that's really hot topics for you in terms of looking at SATs, and then we sometimes sort of forget about it and it sort of falls out of our heads because we don't really tend to cover it that much. So clauses, what I would say about clauses is I'm going to go through them, but don't worry about them because you probably won't. If you don't know about them and you don't talk about them in your exam, it doesn't really matter because they're quite, the theory behind it is very, very linguistic, and you actually looking at it and identifying it and talking about it probably won't be as rich as talking about a language device or technique. So don't worry about it too much is what I'm trying to say in terms of prefacing this. So, main clauses, these are clauses that can stand by themselves. We can chop bits up and they stand by themselves and they make grammatical sense. So, I've got a couple of examples there. So I had pasta and a cheese sauce for lunch and it was so nice I asked for the recipe. So those are 2 very simple examples of main clauses. Sometimes we can put colons in between 2 main clauses because these 2 sort of attach together. We can put a colon in between the middle. But the main takeaway point is that main clauses can stand alone and they make sense. If we chop it off from the rest, it makes sense. Now, subordinate clauses. So a subordinate clause is a clause that cannot stand alone. It doesn't make grammatical sense. So our main clause here is, I had pasta and cheese sauce for lunch. That's a main clause. Then we have our subordinate clause, which was delicious. So subordinate clause adds extra information. You don't necessarily need it. It can be deleted. And the takeaway with subordinate clauses is that it needs to be attached to a main clause in order to make sense. So for example, if we were going to use colons as well, we couldn't put a colon in between the main clause and the subordinate clause. So it doesn't make sense. Right, so that's basically a whistle-stop tour of main clauses, subordinate clauses. Try not to worry about them too much. I don't think I've ever come across one of my students writing about them in language paper 1 question 2. Right, so sentence types. So we've talked about minor, simple, compound and complex sentences. Somebody came up yesterday and said, is an imperative a simple sentence or something along those lines? So I'm going to briefly go over that different type of sentence forms. So there are 4 types of sentences within this bracket. So our first and most common one is the declarative. So these are statements, pieces of information. Basically, you are declaring something. So it was sunny outside. I went to the shops to buy some pasta. So they're pretty straightforward. I wouldn't talk about them in paper 1 question 2 because they're boring and not particularly interesting to talk about. So I wouldn't talk about them. Exclamatives. So exclamatives are a sentence that ends with an exclamation mark. So it's in the kitchen, those flowers are beautiful. So I might possibly comment on that if I was looking at a quotation and the exclamative was at the end. I might say, oh, it's an exclamative. This means that this person is excited or is shouting, something along those lines. But it wouldn't be my main basis for analysis. Interrogatives. So interrogatives, this is where you have a question mark at the end of the sentence. So how long have you been running? Where have I put my shoes? So interrogative, the way to remember this is think interrogate, interrogative. So when you interrogate, you're trying to get information out of somebody. So you are asking them questions, which is interrogatives. So again, I might comment on that if it was in a quotation that I had chosen, but again, it wouldn't be my main focus point. It would be sort of my sort of little bonus piece of terminology in there. Now, imperatives. So this is the one that came up yesterday. So an imperative is an instruction or a command. So for example, I've got get over here now, or put your clothes on, or put your clothes away. So this is the one that I would be most likely to talk about in terms of sentence forms if I was going to pick it out, because usually that tells us something about the character and what the character is trying to get out of somebody else, informs us about their characterization, their personality, and it also informs us about the mood. So if I was going to talk about one of these, I would definitely choose imperatives. In terms of exclamatives and interrogatives, I might throw them in for bonus terminology if they were already in a quotation that I'd picked out. Declarative, I wouldn't mention at all in this scenario because you don't really get anything out of it. Right, so I think that's all for my sentence types. Let's just have a look. So, are there any clauses other than main, subordinate and embedded? No. It was delicious a main or subordinate clause? It was delicious would be a main one, yeah, because you can take those two apart. I think that's all on the Q&A. Let's have a look at the chat. It was very nice as a main clause because it can stand alone. Declarative is just a sort of a basic boring sentence which gives you facts and information. It's just a statement. I'm going on to active and passive now. What is an embedded clause? Right, so An embedded clause is usually where you use parentheses. So I went to the shops. Although it was raining. Because I needed some pasta. I'm going for very carb-based examples this morning. So the embedded clause is although it was raining. So I could take although it was raining out. It's extra information. The sentence will make sense if I take it out. So I could just say I went to the shops because I needed pasta. I'm adding extra information there using what we call parentheses. So that's using a comma before and after that extra piece of information. So that is what an embedded clause looks like. Right, let's move on to active and passive. I don't think there were any other questions. No. So active and passive voice, again, this is quite technical. So everything I've looked at so far is quite technical stuff you will have come across in your studies, but something which you're probably unlikely to use in your question 2, but you could talk about if it was very interesting. So active is where we have the subject at the start. So English, it's syntactic structure is what we call it. So the way we order words is always subject, verb, object. There are other languages which are verb, subject, object, and object, verb, subject. There's a huge variety of how different languages structure things. So for example, I think German uses a different syntax to what we do. I can't remember, it's a long time since I was doing a linguistic degree. So sometimes when we learn different languages, we get the order wrong because we've learnt that we say subject, verb, object, even if we don't know that's what we're saying. That's what our minds are programmed to do. So English is a SVO structure, subject, verb, object. So for example, the robbers stole the diamonds from the safe. So our subject is the robbers, verb is stole, and our object is the diamonds, and a little bit of extra information on the end there. A prepositional phrase, from the safe. Prepositional phrase is telling us where something is in relation to something else. So the diamonds were in the safe. Now, that's active. That is what you will see the vast, vast majority of the time when you are reading texts in English. Now, with passive, this is where we move the subject to after the verb, and the object takes the place of the subject. But in order to do that, we have to add in some extra words, and we have to fiddle about with it a little bit, because if we just said the diamonds stole the robbers, that doesn't make sense. That's not what the original sentence was. So the diamonds in the safe were stolen. So we've got the diamonds, which is the object, in the safe, which is our prepositional phrase, which attaches to the object, the diamonds. The diamonds in the safe were stolen. We've got two verbs together there. And then we've got by the robbers. So we're using by there in order to tell the reader who was doing that action. So that would be the passive voice, where we shift the subject to after the verb, and then the object comes before the verb, and then we have to do a little bit of jiggling in order to get it right and meaning the same things. Right. Okay, so let's just have a quick look at the chat and see if anyone's thrown up some questions. So sentence clauses are just main, subordinate, or embedded. Yeah, we are doing more challenging things. The reason why I'm covering these is because people asked me yesterday what these meant. So these were due to requests. Right, so let's move on to paper 1 question 2. And the questions that you guys have been firing at me quite a lot over this week. So I'm just going to round these up. So how many marks is this question worth? 8. How long should I spend on this question? About 10 minutes. If you are absolutely pushing it, 15. But I would try to keep between probably 10 and 12 minutes. Do I have time to plan? Not in the sense of, right, I'm going to get my piece of paper and I'm going to write down the bullet points of what I'm going to say and a brief sort of few words of how I'm going to say it. This is only worth 8 marks. You've only got 10 minutes. You do not have time to do that. So you'll get your quotation, not your quotation, your little extract. So this is the one that we were working on yesterday. So this is what you will get. Now, what you will see is that I have just highlighted a variety of quotations, phrases, and I would label them and say this is alliteration, and that is all the planning I would do. I would just briefly do some annotations as I read, and then I would just use that as the basis, sort of effectively a very, very brief plan, just identifying and doing feature spotting. Which bullet point is the most important to talk about? There isn't a hierarchy. You do not have to, there isn't more marks for one than there is the other. They are all equal. So you can do words and phrases, you can do sentence forms, and you can do language, features, and devices. You can do any 3, it doesn't matter. How do I make sure I write about the correct part of the extract? So this occasionally, students will be given a text. So for example, you get your insert. This is something completely different, but you get your insert and you're told to look at lines 12 to 24. Now, some of you might choose to just annotate your insert. That's completely fine. The nice thing about paper 1 question 2 is they print out the extract on the answer page for you in your answer booklet. So you can see it in front of you. Now, if you're doing that, you'll be absolutely safe and you won't be talking about the wrong piece of the text. But occasionally some people decide, right, I'm just going to work from the insert, which makes complete sense in terms of you're only annotating the text once. So I would, if you are going to do that, make sure that you draw a box or a line, or you perhaps highlight that one paragraph down the side and write question 2 next to it to make sure you are not going outside of that area, because you won't get any credit if you talk about anything outside of the little section that you have been given. Do I have to talk about all the bullet points? No. It says you could talk about the writer's choice of. The important word there is could. So you do not have to talk about all of them. So as I've sort of been emphasising to you across this week, you don't have to write about sentence forms if you don't think you can talk about something very specific and do it well. If you think, oh, I'm not sure I can do that very well, or I'm not sure if there's anything really interesting to say about it, you don't have to talk about it. Do the other 2. The main 2 I would say is do words and phrases and do language devices and techniques, because they will be definitely the easier ones for you to do. I've had some students who've told me that their teachers say ignore sentence forms, bullet points. I wouldn't go that far, but don't feel that you absolutely have to talk about it because it's there. It says you could talk about them. How many paragraphs should I write? So I would say 2 really chunky paragraphs or 3 slightly smaller ones. So as I've been doing with you throughout the week, they don't look particularly chunky because they are typed, but if I wrote these down, they would probably be half a page long each. So don't worry about doing, right, so I've said personification for this one. I've done my little bit of analysis. Now I need to find another technique. And then I need to talk about that. And then I need to find another technique. And I need to talk about that. You don't have to do personification, a little bit of analysis, personification, a little bit of analysis. Do really chunky ones. Pull that text apart and talk about as much as you possibly can for that quotation, because that's what flies you up through the marks. Which quotations should I use? Now, throughout the week, I've been using quotations which are really rich, which have more than one language feature that I can talk about, or has a really interesting word which I can take further. So if you've got a quotation which you think, oh, there's alliteration there and there's personification, and I can link that to that other quotation which uses a metaphor, do that, because the more you can get out of a single quotation, the better. The more detail you can go into, the more you can talk about, the better in terms of the marks you will receive. Right, so this is the assessment objective you are being asked to meet. So I'm just going to have a quick look through Q&As. I don't know for OCR, I'm not familiar with it, I haven't taught it, so I'm unable to help you with that one. So AO2 then, so explain, comment on and analyse how writers use language and structure to achieve effects and influence readers using relevant subject terminology to support their view. Right. So, I'm sure I'd highlighted this, but perhaps I haven't. So, you need to explain, comment, analyse. Now, in terms of structure, ignore that one for this question. AO2 covers both question 2 and question 3. So we're looking at writing using language here and achieving the effects. So we need to say how they influence the reader. We need to use subject terminology, and we need to analyse and comment on why the writer has chosen to do that. So in terms of how we relate this to structure, so a few of you asked me, how on earth do I structure my writing? So these are a few of the different ways schools teach you how to structure your answers from the students I've been teaching over the last few months. So there are a relatively, how should we say it, they're all much of a muchness. They're very similar, although they're using different words. So they're all basically asking you to quickly say what your point is, and then give some evidence, and then do some analysis. And then some of them ask you to link back to the question. So they all pretty much mean the same thing, is what I'm trying to get at. Now, what I've been trying to say to you throughout the week is, if you have been taught to do any of these, that is absolutely fine. However, you will find that these limit the marks you can get if you just stick to these as a straitjacket. So you probably won't get more than 5 marks if you follow these as written. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of what that looks like on the page following these examples. So in order to achieve the higher marks, first, this is sort of my extension of what you need to be doing in terms of how to structure. So you need to do your analysis. So we've got a point, we've got our evidence, we've got our sort of first level basic analysis, then zooming in on something, commenting on something smaller within that quotation, talking about the details of it. Can we relate that to context? The people who do really well in this question consider the context that's been given, and they also give alternative interpretations. So yesterday, if you remember, we were looking at sentence forms, and I gave 2 possible interpretations for why those might be, which shows that I'm able to think outside of the box and comprehend more than one way of why the writer might have chosen to do that. So it's showing a very high level of thinking, which will get you far in terms of your marks. So that's sort of the first little section of your AO2. So that's your explain, comment and analyse the effects achieved by the writer and influencing the reader. Always good to say, this makes the reader feel, or this might make the reader feel, or this makes me feel. That's fine as well. You can say that, that's not a problem. Now, using relevant subject terminology to support their views. Support is really, really important here. So if you just go into the exam and feature spot and say, here's personification, here's my example, this shows that I'm thinking what we've looked at. So I've done a past paper one on the videos, which is up on the online school, about the T-Rex. This makes a T-Rex show that he's really angry and vicious. That would basically be feature spotting, because you're just telling me that's personification, here's my evidence, and here's a really basic level analysis. It doesn't really get you very far in terms of marks. So it needs to be there to support your views. So it's basically setting you up for getting the big marks. So saying, here's personification, here's my evidence. Now here's why it's effective, here's what I'm zooming in on, and this is what I think. This is how the reader feels by this use of the quotation here that I'm looking at. And this is why I think it's there. The question focuses on why those features are there. You need to talk about their purpose. Just saying, oh, this shows that the T-Rex is vicious, he's angry, you know, someone that I don't want to be around, is quite basic. You need to take it much further and talk about why on earth the writers put it there, what the imagery is telling and suggesting to you. So I'm going to go through the mark scheme a little bit and sort of decode what on earth the difference is between the level 4 and the level 3. Now, they look incredibly similar. So the first bullet point we've got analyses the effects of the writer's choice of language. Then the level 3 explains clearly the effects of the writer's choices of language. They seem almost identical. Selects a range of judicious textual detail, selects a range of relevant textual detail, and then we've got makes sophisticated and accurate use of subject terminology and makes clear and accurate use of subject terminology. So I'm going to give you some examples of what on earth the differences of these two are, because teachers quite often argue about what they mean, let alone you guys. So I'm going to show you a text. So this is, if it isn't already, it will be up for you guys to have a go at as a past paper. So a little bit of context before we get into it. So this text was taken from the middle of H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds, written in 1898. This extract describes the arrival of the Martians in their attempt to take over the world as we know it. So this is the bullet point I'm going to be looking at. So analysing the effects of the writer's choice of language. So first off, I'm just going to read you the extract. I'm just going to double check this too. There is 2 papers, so we cannot use Peel, as that is what my school said since year 7. Yeah, so in terms of Peel, use it as a basis. Start using, when you start writing, use Peel, but you need to take it further to get really high marks. So what I'm saying with them is don't throw them out of the window. Use them to start off with, but take them further so you do deeper analysis. Yeah, so absolutely link it back to the question. When you get to the end of the paragraph and think I've done writing and I've pulled this to pieces, link it back. Absolutely. I'm not saying don't use these. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is use them to get you going, but take it further. So don't feel like, oh, I've written 2 sentences for analysis. I'll move on to my next one. Write as much analysis as you possibly can. So don't feel straitjacketed by, I've done my basic point, I've done my basic evidence and my basic analysis. Take it further than a couple of sentences is basically what I'm trying to say to you guys. Don't feel like you need to write short paragraphs. The long, chunky paragraphs are really good for question 2s, because that's what AQA are looking for. They're moving away from just a clear point evidence analysis. Right. So the decapitated colossus reeled like a drunken giant, but it did not fall over. It recovered its balance by a miracle, and no longer heeding its steps, and with the camera that fired the heat ray now rigidly upheld, it reeled swiftly upon Shepperton. The living intelligence, the Martian within the hood, was slain and splashed to the four winds of heaven, and the thing was now but a mere intricate device of metal whirling to destruction. It drove along in a straight line, incapable of guidance. It struck the tower of Shepperton Church, smashing it down as the impact of a battering ram might have done, swerved aside, blundering on and collapsed with tremendous force into the river out of sight. A violent explosion shook the air, and a spout of water, steam, mud, and shattered metal shot far up into the sky. As the camera of the heat ray hit the water, the latter had immediately flashed into the stream. In another moment, a huge wave, like a muddy tidal bore, but almost scalding hot, came sweeping round the bent stream. I saw people struggling shorewards and heard their screaming and shouting faintly above the seething and roar of the Martian's collapse. Right, so that's the extract we're basing this off. I'm not going to do live modelling today because I wanted to crack through all these different things that you guys wanted to look at. So, response 1 then. So violence is used continually throughout this passage, smashing it down as the impact of a battering ram. The use of the onomatopoeia smashing makes the reader aware of how dangerous the Martians are, as well as creating a central description. The simile, as the impact of a battering ram, demonstrates the ferociousness and unforgiving nature of the Martians. The idea that a ram could be battering something tells the reader how the Martians have no remorse and are willing to destroy anything that gets in their way. So, our green then is representing where our little bits of analysis are. So as you can see, there's a tiny little bit here and here, which is this is basically contextual, just saying it's happening throughout. A little reference to the reader. And then down here we've got our more sort of chunky descriptions and analyses of why they're there. Now our purple is the quotations I'm using, so you can see that I've chosen 2 quotations and I've zoomed in on the verbs as well. And then my use of terminology, so I've got onomatopoeia in here, sensual description and the simile. So this would come in at the level 3 band. So there's clear effects, and we're talking about why the writer has said them, but we're not really talking contextually about how that links to things outside of the text, what we think of, how the reader might feel in some detail we haven't really covered. In terms of choosing the quotations, I've done quite a straightforward big quotation, zoom in, big quotation, zoom in. But I've linked 2 together, and I've used accurately subject terminology, but I haven't got loads and loads in here. I haven't mentioned that these are verbs, so that's something I could go on to do, and that would bump me up to the next level. Right. Yeah, we are going to be looking at question 4s and 5s in the future, so don't worry about that one. Is P better than P? I suppose because you're adding a link and a little bit of extra information, if you do it well, then yes. Right, let's move on and look at response 2. Oh, it's fallen off the bottom. The semantic field of violence is used continually throughout the passage, smashing it down as the impact of a battering ram. The use of the onomatopoeic verb, smashing, informs the reader of the relentlessness of the attack that the Martians are carrying out, as well as creating a clear, multifaceted central description. The simile, as the impact of a battering ram, demonstrates the ferociousness and unforgiving nature of the Martians. Rams have the ability to defend themselves with their own bodies, using their horns to charge and injure anything that they deem as a threat. It therefore could be suggested that the Martians have a variety of similar weapons, I think that is, that's fallen off the end. So first off, the obvious thing is that it's longer and it's chunkier. So in terms of the difference of what I've spoken about, So let's first off look at the accurate use of terminology and the sophisticated nature. So I've said the semantic field of violence. So I just said in the first one, violence is used continually. So now I'm saying, I'm now attaching that to semantic field. I'm also mentioning the verb as well here. And instead of talking about what battering means, I'm actually taking on a different point of view towards that. So we'll look at the analysis in a minute. And I've also said a clear, multifaceted central description. So that just means we're not just looking at sight, we're also talking about here, it's sort of panoramic, that we are there. Right, so in terms of the quotations I have chosen, they are pretty much the same. In fact, entirely the same, apart from battering is not there. I think battering has fallen off the bottom and why we can't see it. So really there isn't much difference. However, it's how I'm using them which takes me up to that that next level. And then our analysis, so we're looking at the green. So this is all the same. It's how I deal with this quotation here. So I'm talking contextually about rams, what I know about them, why it might be likened to a ram, why the writer has chosen to do that. So that sort of takes on my sort of wider world knowledge and puts that into my analysis and shows how I understand the text. Why on earth would we mention a ram in the first place? Why not another animal that's sort of more vicious? I mean, rams aren't particularly vicious animals, but the only thing that sort of stands out to me is the fact that they can do quite serious damage with their horns. So that's how I've linked it to the Martians and why I think the writer has done that. So I've taken that step further, I've contextualised it, I've used my wider world knowledge in order to inform my analysis. So that's what takes me up to the level 4. Right, anything that I've missed? What is sensual? Sensual description is the use of senses. So see, hear, feel, taste. What's the other one? See, hear, feel, taste, smell. Yes, so you can use P paragraphs, absolutely, just don't do a little bit of explanation, that's what I'm trying to say. Do your basic level, so here you can see that I've done my basic level and then I've taken it much further. So I've made my point, here's my evidence, and then I zoom in a little bit more, so some more evidence, more terminology, then I do my basic level analysis. Then I take it further to do some more in-depth analysis. I throw in some more terminology, some more evidence, and then I do my high level analysis, which throws me back up to that level 4. So what I'm trying to say is do your point, evidence, explanation, but make sure that you do your zooming in, you give your alternative descriptions. Don't feel like, oh, I've done my point, evidence, and my basic level analysis, I'm done. That's what I'm trying to get at. Make sure that you take it further and you really think and show off to the examiner that you understand this text. So use it, absolutely, but make sure that you take it further and you do a really nice bit of high level analysis. So my tips and tricks then. So I've had a look over the examiner reports. I also sent out on my teacher Twitter asking some teachers what they felt their students commonly did, which limited their marks, and this is what has come back from those 2 resources. So do pick short quotations. If you are going to pick out a quotation and you think, so I think yesterday or the day before, I chose a quotation which I wanted something from the end, something from the start and something from the end of a sentence, but I didn't want to write all of it. So I chose a little bit I wanted from the start, I put my ellipsis, my ... and then the bit that I wanted from the end, and that signals to the examiner that you've taken a little bit out which wasn't relevant. You can do that, that's absolutely fine. Consider the context you are given. So read what you have been told in your little brief before you start answering, and consider perhaps contextually how you might analyse, use your world knowledge for things that are being spoken about in that text. So like I did with the RAM. Consider why the devices are effective. So yeah, absolutely do feature spotting as sort of your little annotations, your little plan as you're reading, your active reading. But you need to consider why they're effective and why they are there. You need to consider why the writer has chosen to do things. So linking to the effectiveness, you could comment on how that might make the reader feel and why that particular effect is important to the story arc or that particular paragraph that you're looking at. Use as much terminology as you can. I'm going to limit this a little bit to don't throw in absolutely everything that you can possibly think of. So saying subject, verb, objects, you don't need to. So with this one, I've said instead of onomatopoeia, I've just put the onomatopoeic verb. Just a little bit extra there. I've said semantic field of violence instead of just saying violence. Just taking it a little bit further, but don't do it so that it's really, really over the top and you're labelling absolutely sort of every word class. Don't worry about it. You don't need to do it. Choose relevant quotations that you can say a lot about. So as I said, if there's a quotation which you think that's got 2 features in it and a really interesting word, choose the ones that you can write a lot about. The more you can write, the better. So don't choose something. So for example, yesterday we had bird bath as alliteration. It's not interesting. You can't really say anything exciting about it. Choose something which is meaty. So don't paraphrase your quotations. You need to be using speech marks and you need to be copying them and you need to be making sure that you are copying them correctly. So first couple of things that you might do, you might choose a quotation and then add in a word or get a word wrong. Make sure that you are copying it word for word and make sure that you are spelling those words correctly. It's surprising the amount of students who copy out a quotation that is in front of them and they misspell something. It's there in front of you, use it. Comment on something that isn't in the extract. So as I said, make sure that if you are going to look at your insert rather than what is on your answer paper in front of you, that you are looking at that piece of text that you have been given, that extract from that text, and that only. If you write anything outside of it, even if you do it well, you can't be credited for it. Pick out a feature and say nothing else. Don't just feature spots. It will limit you in the marks that you can get. And talk about sentence forms if there isn't something interesting to talk about. So I've been over that loads of times and I've battered you over the head with that one, so I won't go any further. Right, in terms of exam efficiency then, read the questions, read all of those questions 1, 2, 3 and 4 before you start reading. Then you will be actively reading, you will be actively looking for things, and you can sort of save time in your annotations when you come to doing each question because you will already have done some of them as you go. Use a highlighter or underline keywords and quotations in the question and the text. I did this all the way up to my university exams. I was awful for answering a question that I wasn't being asked. Make sure that you highlight. If you are one of these people, I was dreadful for it until I got to about GCSE. And the way I got around it was highlighting or underlining the keywords. So I really got that question inside my head and I knew exactly what I was doing. Highlight quotations as you go, which you think might be helpful. That'll save you later coming back trying to find them again. Keep in mind the questions that you're going to cover whilst you read, so actively reading, and keep your eye on the clock. So if you've done your 10 to 12 minutes on this question and you think, oh, I could write more, there's more inside me that I can put on this page. I know it's heartbreaking, but move on. This is only an 8 marker. You've got bigger questions coming up. You've got your 40 marker right at the end. If you sort of go 5 minutes over each question, you're going to get to your 40 marker and you're going to severely limit the amount you can write for that 40 marker, which will limit your marks. So think, right, I've done my 12 minutes. I could write more, but I don't have time right now. If I've got time at the end, I'll come back and finish it off. Don't feel like you've got to write a perfect answer and spend double the time on it. It's not worth it. You can't improve your marks that much by writing that much more. Right, so in terms of revision, So, as Frederica said, all of these are recorded. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but here's a load of terminology. So the pride smile, some other ones that we've come up with, and word classes as well. These are the only word classes I would bother labelling, which we call content words. Function words are things like prepositions and pronouns, basically the words which are really hard to define. Determiners like the, how do we even explain what the means? Yeah. Identifying word classes. So these are a few little tips and tricks for working those out if you're not sure. So I've given you sort of a brief definition of what each of those are. So for nouns, can the word be replaced by a pronoun? So he, she, or they. If it can, brilliant, it's a noun. Verbs, so can you inflect it for tense? So we talked a little bit about that previously. So walk, walked, run and ran if it's irregular and the vowel changes instead of putting on a suffix. Adjectives, can the word be put into the following sentence? So I am happy, or I feel happy. Can it be put in there? If it can, yeah, adjective. Adverb, so first off, the big red flag for you is, does it end in ly? Not all words end in ly are adverbs, but vast majority of the time they are. And the other one is, does it modify the verb in some way? So I walked quickly, it's telling me how that verb is happening. So that's a brief way of how to identify those word classes. Those are the sentence forms that you could potentially look at as well, on top of the clauses as well. And then in terms of practice, so how are we helping you? So these are the texts that I have given, and some of them might be up, I'm not quite sure, but they will be going up for you to have a go at. So you've got 4 19th century texts. So they're some of them have full answers for you. Some of them just have bullet points of the features you could talk about. Frankenstein and Anita and Me I have put in bold because those are set texts for your literature. 20th century, you've got 6 texts to go at, and 21st century, you've got 2. So there's a huge range of different ones you could go at from a different range of times and genres as well. So there's, I think, pretty much something there for everybody that you might read or enjoy. And I think that's pretty much everything. So I've run a couple of minutes over it in terms of starting the Q&A. So if you've got any questions on question 2, please throw them my way, and I will do my best to answer them.
Hi Vicky, I've seen a few questions. What does judicious mean?
Yeah, judicious. So judicious is selecting quotations really, really effectively, really clear, and being really accurate and precise with quotations that you should be picking out.
Great. Someone has asked, do you have any advice on how to stay calm in an exam? I always panic and stress out and then try to focus my thoughts, but by the time I've calmed down, I've run out of time.
Yeah, so this is something I really, really struggled with when I first started doing my exams in year 10. I was and am a awful worrier. The way that I calm myself down was doing sort of a little bit of meditation. My mum was a trained hypnotherapist, so she sort of helped me out with a few tips on sort of what I used to do is I used to choose a point on my hand. So if I had like a little spot, so now I didn't wear rings at the time, but I would probably focus on my ring, and I would just spend time doing some deep breathing and some focusing on my ring and just that before the exam actually happened. But as I was going into the exam hall and whilst all the question papers were being handed out, I would just spend some time just doing some deep breathing and just chilling out and putting everything else out of my head. At the time, there wasn't really any sort of apps or anything like that to sort of help you practice that. So I haven't done it for a few months actually, but I was doing Headspace, which is an app that you can download. They have some free packs on there where you just it just helps you to do like 10 minutes meditation a day or 5 minutes. and you can also pay a subscription for it, which I did because there's a huge range of stuff on there that they offer, and I think they do some stuff for exam nerves, definitely for sort of panicking in situations and managing that. So that's a really good place to go for resources. And now there'll be loads of stuff on YouTube in terms of meditation as well, which would be free. There's the Calm app as well. I haven't used it, but I've had that recommended to me. So yeah, using some of those resources, and it absolutely stood me in good stead, and I sort of eventually grew out of it as I went on. It sort of became normal to me that I was just in exams because I was in them all the time, as you guys know. It gets a little bit relentless after a little while, the amount of exams you have to take. So that's how I used to do it. Semantic means meaning, basically. So semantics is all to do with meanings of words. So a semantic field is words that fit into a particular category. So for example, the semantic field of fairy tales would be witches, wands, fairy godmothers, castles, princesses, that sort of thing. How many papers in the English language exam? 2 in language and 2 in literature. So paper 1 that we've been working on this week is fiction, and paper 2 is non-fiction. Romeo and Juliet is 16th, 17th century, really old. What did I grade did I get in GCSE? I got an A. I was in old money then. In terms of inspector calls, so I'm not going to mention anything about that because we're doing English language and that is English literature. Are we going to do paper 2? I imagine in the future we will get round to it. We're doing paper 1 question 3 next week. Have I missed anything else? Let's have a look in the chat. Yeah, I haven't talked about question 1 because it's pretty straightforward, but I will talk a little bit now. So question 1 is only 4 marks. For this one, you are asked, first off, you're told in lines 1 to 5, how does the character react to, and then whatever. So it's literally just picking out and retrieving information, which is usually pretty straightforward. Most people get full marks and only spend maybe 3 or 4 minutes on that question. The only place where people tend to lose marks is because they don't write in full sentences. So for question 1, you need to write in full sentences. Don't just sort of write quotations in. So for example, let's see what I've got. So this little text I've been showing you, which is a teaching English as a foreign language text. So I took this photo a couple of years ago. So that's how it starts. So I would perhaps write down, this woman took this photo 2 years ago, full stop. And that's all you need to write. Really brief sentences, but they need to be full sentences. That's why we're not going over question 1, because they're quite straightforward. What websites do you recommend in accessing audiobooks for free online? To be honest with you, I tend to use YouTube. If it's a well-known text, you can usually find someone reading it for free on YouTube. So I've done that for a couple of books. I did that for The Handmaid's Tale. Thinking, what else have I done it for? Frankenstein and Dracula, I think. I've found texts on YouTube being read by someone. So have a little look on YouTube and see if there's any audiobooks on there. There usually are for definitely the older texts. So that's probably a good place to look. Apart from that, I don't know. I know audio, what's it called? The Amazon one, Audible. They offer you a free trial and you can get a free audiobook. But I'm not really sure how it works because I haven't done it myself. Spelling, you don't get a mark for that in your question 2. You just get a mark for that, I think, in definitely in your question 5. You might get it for your question 4 as well. Seeing if there's anything else. No, I don't remember what questions were in my language exam. Right, so Jekyll and Hyde and Inspector Calls. So again, that's literature, so I won't be chatting about those. What is the difference between English language and English literature? So literature, you're given set texts and you study those. So you'll have your Shakespeare, your 19th century, your modern prose or play, and poetry. So with AQA you have either love and relationships or power and conflict. And then you get your unseen poetry as well. So the unseen is the only thing that you don't know what's coming at you. With English language, you don't know what text you're going to get, and that's more about sort of basic word and sentence level analysis. Whereas with literature, you look at sort of wider contexts, the author's past, the author's feelings, how that's affected the text, the time that those texts are written at, and what implications that might create. You do look at sort of language features and devices like we've been looking at, but you wouldn't be looking at them at sort of in-depth sort of paragraph level like we've been looking at in the exam, because you don't have the text in front of you and you're looking at the text as a whole rather than this, which is a small extract of texts. Yeah, again, so poetry, that would come under literature, so I'm not going to go over that. Which paper do you choose the option like descriptive, picture, or write the start of a story? So that is paper 1, and that is your question 5. So hopefully that will be coming up in the future. Yeah, so you either get given a picture to talk about, or you get given a instruction, like write a story about a time you felt scared, or you get a first sentence. So I walked into the room and saw, and then you have to carry it on. Is there another one as well? I think that might be the options you get. Right, I think, what is the hardest part in English GCSE? I think it depends purely on how you find it. I think it's completely dependent on you and what your brain tends to favour. Structure, which we're going to look at next week, a lot of students struggle with. So I'm going to go over what the difference between a question 2 and a question 3 is, because students tend to write very similar answers for both. Obviously the creative writings are quite difficult because you're writing for prolonged periods of time, but it just depends on the individual. I think personally, I don't think there's anything which is outright particularly harder. It just depends on you. Right, Frederica, are there any questions that you found that I haven't answered?
No, but I think we're out of time anyway. So thank you so much everyone for joining us today for the English session. And just to remind you that there will be an English session or English sessions next week, but not on Monday because it's a bank holiday, and nothing on Friday because it's a bank holiday as well. Thanks everyone, and see you soon. Bye.
Bye.